the top 5%, we want to get more money from them, so let's raise their tax rates. Sometimes the average person is going to clap in response to that speech, because we sometimes all feel jealousy at someone who's more successful. But what actually happens when you put in those high tax rates? When you put in those high tax rates, people don't work as much, they don't save as much, they don't invest as much, they don't comply with the tax law nearly as much, and governments collect less revenue. Now, let's actually go back 2 slides. No, go back to the chart. One more. And one more. Now, this Laffer curve is just a picture. It doesn't really tell us where is the revenue maximizing tax rate, and it doesn't tell us the growth maximizing tax rate. All I'm trying to get across to you is to understand the concept that sometimes tax rates are so high the government loses revenue. But even if you're on the left side of that curve, that doesn't mean you shouldn't cut taxes. Let's say that your tax rate is 25%, and you put in place a 15% tax rate instead. At those levels, according to the academic research, at those levels, the government will probably lose revenue by cutting tax rates from 25% to 15%. But it's not going to lose nearly as much revenue as it thinks. And the economy will grow faster, and there will be more taxable income. So taxable income will increase, and the government will be able to tax that additional taxable income, but that won't be enough to offset the effect of the lower tax rate. But that's where it's very important to then ask yourself a question. What do we want to maximize? Do we want to maximize income, or do we want to maximize tax revenue for government? So even if El Salvador reduced tax revenues by lowering tax rates, it's still probably a good thing to do. Let's go one slide. Here are a few other examples of the Laffer curve. I wanted to give you that example from the Reagan years first because I think it's very powerful. But we have lots of other examples. Russia used to have a traditional so-called progressive tax system. Russia put in place a 13% flat tax. A lot of people, especially the international bureaucracies like the IMF, said, "Oh, you shouldn't do a flat tax. You're not going to collect enough revenue." Income tax revenue under the 13% flat tax in Russia is more than 3 times as high as when they used to have a progressive system with a top rate of 30%. Russia clearly benefited, and even the Russian politicians benefited, by putting in place a flat tax. Another good example is Ireland. Ireland used to have a 50% corporate tax rate, 50, not 15, 50. A 50% corporate tax rate. Imagine that. You guys are in the business world, and you ladies too. We say you guys, it means everybody in America. You people are in business. Imagine if the government took half of every dollar of profit. You would have much less incentive to earn profit, and you certainly would have an incentive not to tell the government if you did get profit. Well, Ireland reduced its corporate tax rate from 50% all the way down to 12.5%. What happened? Well, just like in the United States, the left-wingers in Ireland, the socialists in Ireland said, that's not fair. We want big business to pay more money. We don't want big business to pay less money, and you're reducing the tax rate on big business from 50% down to 12.5%. So what actually happened? Well, if you go back about 25 years ago, when the top tax rate on corporations was 50% in Ireland, you will see that the Irish government collected about 1% of GDP in corporate tax revenue. And GDP back then was very small because it was a very poor country. Let's now fast forward about 25 years. Well, actually, this year, like every place else, Ireland's in a recession, so they're probably actually not collecting much revenue at all this year. But generally speaking, before the recession, what was happening in Ireland? when the tax rate was 12.5%. The Irish government was collecting about 3% of GDP. So think about that. A 50% tax rate, the government was collecting 1% of GDP in corporate tax revenue. A 12.5% tax rate, and the government was collecting 3% of GDP in corporate tax revenue. And keep in mind that GDP was much, much bigger because of the lower tax rate. Ireland went from being one of the poorest economies in Europe to being one of the richest economies in Europe. So think about what that means. When you have very low taxes on business, business can create lots of jobs, business can have lots of investment, that creates a bigger tax base, more taxable income for the government, and so even at a very low tax rate, the government was getting plenty of revenue. As a matter of fact, in the case of Ireland, they were getting more revenue. That was one of those cases on the Laffer curve where the government was clearly on the wrong side, where they were losing revenue. Let's we already gave those examples. Go another one. Now, let's look at some good news. We have something called tax competition in the world. And let me actually stop for a minute here to sort of discuss that in the sense of what it means for El Salvador. You want to become a rich country. One of the easiest ways to become a rich country, a shortcut to becoming a rich country, is to convince a lot of investors to bring money into your economy. You want companies and investors from around the world to be building factories, to be investing money in El Salvador. You know, normally, if you look at, say, the history of the United States, how did the United States become rich? Well, people in the United States had to work, then they saved and invested. That saving and investment enabled more growth. So we had to get rich over a very long period of time. But if you don't want to wait 150 years to become rich, you can take a shortcut by convincing a lot of other people to come and save and invest in your economy. But to do that, it's very important that you have a very, very competitive tax system. Because I can guarantee you, even if you disagree philosophically with what I'm saying, one thing clearly is true. The big companies, the big investors, the big entrepreneurs around the world can choose to invest in El Salvador, or they can go to Nicaragua, or Mexico, or China, or India, or Hong Kong, or Ireland. There are hundreds of places around the world where people can create jobs and invest money. And if your politicians here in El Salvador get too greedy, and they say, we want to tax companies, we want the companies to give us money so we can buy votes and get reelected, what's going to happen? Those companies are going to leave, or they're not going to come here in the first place. And you will hurt your chances of taking a shortcut on the path to becoming rich. In reality, just because the rooster crows, that doesn't cause the sun to come up, but at least I was smart enough to go give a speech before they announced it, so I can take credit for it. Let's go to the next slide and show some of the details about what's happened because of tax competition. These are the industrialized economies of the world, and it shows the top tax rate beginning in 1980 and going up to 2007. The top tax rate used to be about 68%. Now it's down around 40%. That's still far too high. Far, far too high. Most of those countries could actually increase revenue by lowering the tax rate further. But look at the progress they've made because of tax competition. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide, I was too lazy to make a chart, but here are the numbers for corporate tax rates. In 1980, the average corporate tax rate was 48%. And actually, this chart is old. I should have updated it. We're now down to a 26% average corporate tax rate. Again, that's still too high, but it's progress. And why have countries lowered corporate tax rates? I mean, people understand, well, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, they were free market radicals. So they lowered tax rates because they actually believed in it. They believed in more freedom and more liberty. But have there ever been politicians in France or Germany or Japan that believed in more freedom? No. I mean, I think French babies, when they're still in the womb, are told to become socialists. But even French politicians over the years have lowered tax rates. Why? Not because they want to. They probably hated it. It's sort of like, when you go to the doctor and you get a shot. Nobody likes getting a shot, but you understand, well, I better get immunized, or I better take this medicine to become better. We don't like getting a shot, but we do it because we understand it's good for us. Well, likewise, French politicians and German politicians, who are all socialists, the supposedly conservative German politicians are more left-wing than American Democrats. That's how bad they are. But even they lowered tax rates. Why? Because of competition and globalization. Let's go to and by the way, America's corporate tax rate is terrible. We're one of the worst in the world. Only Japan has a higher corporate tax rate than us. This is the number of flat tax nations. I already mentioned. It used to be 3. Now there's 27. Hungary's about to be 28. Now let me elaborate on something I mentioned before. Because I think if I had time, I would repeat this 10 times, but I'm only going to repeat it twice because I assume this is an audience of good, smart people. If you want a welfare state, let's say that you're someone who just believes personally in socialism. If you want a welfare state, the one thing I want to convince you of, you have to become rich first. This is sort of like the president of Brazil. The president of Brazil understands this. You have to become rich first. So do not look around the world today and say Sweden and France are rich and they have a welfare state, so therefore El Salvador can become rich by adopting a welfare state. That is wrong. Sweden and France became rich when they had no income tax and they had very small government. So if you want to copy France and Sweden, if you want to adopt a welfare state, which those countries did basically beginning in the 1960s, then you have to go through 150 years first of small government, because that's what France and Sweden did. This is the chart that I thought I had earlier that I forgot about. You're not going to be able to read it, but it's a chart from 1870 to 1960. And it shows 6 countries, Sweden, England, the United States, Japan, Germany, and France. And it shows government spending as a share of GDP. And the top of the chart is 50% of GDP. Well, today, France and England and Sweden all spend more than 50% of GDP. So if we extended that chart from 1960 to 2010, you would see some countries way above the top of the chart. But back in 1870, when countries like France and Sweden were becoming rich, they had government spending of less than 10% of GDP, as did the United States, as did Japan, and other countries. Even as recently as 1913, government spending averaged 12% of GDP. And even if you go all the way through the Great Depression, past World War II, you get all the way to 1960, you still have government spending averaging only about 25% of GDP. Now, why am I showing you these numbers? I'm showing you these numbers because El Salvador today is at the level of economic development that these countries were somewhere between 1870 and 1913. And if you want to become rich, like those countries became rich, I will say to you, yes, copy Sweden, but don't copy Sweden today, copy Sweden back when it became rich. That's the challenge for El Salvador. And this is my frustration. When I talk to people at the IMF and the World Bank, these people, I think, have their hearts in the right place. People, for the most part, go to the IMF and the World Bank because they want to help try to make the world more prosperous. They usually also go because they get tax-free salaries, but let's set that aside. The people at the IMF and the World Bank want to do the right thing, but they just don't understand that the right thing has to be put in historical context. If they think it is nice to have a welfare state, they need to remember the important lesson of getting rich first. The president of Brazil understands it.